It's camp week. If you're a Pitt fan and you've been jealous of all the Steeler fans that have their training camp to follow and all the coverage and the photos and the videos and the reports and all those different things, and you're like, man, when does my camp start? When does my favorite team start to practice so I can be talking about them all the time? Well, here it is. It's not today, and it's not tomorrow. But it's Wednesday. Wednesday is the start of training camp for Pitt football. Panthers kick off training camp on July 30th, exactly a month to the day prior to the start of the season when they opened the 2025 season at Acrisure Stadium against Duquesne. It all gets started on Wednesday. So obviously today, tomorrow, Wednesday, we're going to be filling up these Morning Pitt airwaves and video waves or whatever you want to call it, getting you ready for the start of the season. Now, in some respects, you could probably say that we spent the last 8 months getting you ready for the start of the season, and that's true. But today, tomorrow, Wednesday, we're just going to sum it all up. We're going to roll it all into a big ball for you and make sure that when training camp starts on Wednesday, you know exactly what's important, what to talk about, what to ask about, what you're curious about, what you're going to be watching, what you're going to be thinking about, what you're going to be talking to your friends about. And that's what this is really about here for these next couple days before training camp starts. And then we have training camp stuff to talk about every day going forward. So let's jump into it. Let's get the week started. Let's get the training camp week started right here with the Morning Pitt. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's Monday. It's the Morning Pitt. It's youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com. You know the website. You see it below, Panther-Lair.com, the Pitt side on the 24/7 Sports Network, where you can get all the Pitt coverage you can possibly handle. We'll have all kinds of training camp preview content for you today and tomorrow and Wednesday. Hell, for the last, 10 weeks? The last 2.5 months, we've had training camp preview content for you every single day, position by position, looking at it from all angles to get you ready for the 2025 football season. Yeah, we started back in May with the position preview series, and we'll compile those all together, today and tomorrow, just so you can kind of refresh yourself on everything you need to know about every position on the team, offense and defense. But then we'll also have the content right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So make sure you like this video and subscribe, and you won't miss any of our Pitt video content. These daily Morning Pitt videos, our weekly live show every Wednesday night, press conferences, post-game shows, interviews. We'll have a lot of video content coming out of training camp. We'll have video of the players working out, going through drills. We'll have interviews with the coaches and the players and Pat Narduzzi and all that stuff. Every day, there's going to be something cooking up here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So make sure you don't miss it by liking this video and subscribing, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. All right. So for today, like I said, over the next 3 days, today, tomorrow, Wednesday, leading into the start of training camp, we're going to be covering everything that you need to know heading into camp. All the things that are important, all the things that you need to be sort of have readily available. You know what I mean? That you can turn to your friend and be like, well, they blah, 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 or, oh, well, they blah, 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 or this is the important thing you need to know about that. We're going to try and give you the Cliff Notes today on some of the most important sort of factoids and details about this 2025 Pitt football roster, the coaching staff, the players, everything, incoming players, departing players, coaching changes or staff changes, of which there were none, which is relevant enough on its own. We'll talk about that and give you the context on it. All the little sort of details. You need to be able to turn to your friend, when you're at the tailgate or you're hanging out before the season or something. You need to be able to turn to your friend and be like, yo, they lost 24 guys to the portal and added 16 out of the portal, but there's actually a little caveat within those numbers. You want to be the smartest Pitt fan in your group of Pitt fans, right? Today's podcast is all about giving you the details and the information and the data so you are ready to do it. All right, so let's start it off here. Let's talk returning starters, departing starters, open starting jobs. By my count, on offense, Pitt has 7 returning starters. Okay, quarterback, running back, 2 receivers, center, right guard, right tackle. 7 returning starters. On defense, they've had 6. 2 D tackles, 2 outside linebackers, a corner, and a safety. So we're looking at 13 returning starters on both sides of the ball combined, plus a punter. Of course, on the flip side, you've got an open job at left guard, open job at left tackle, open job at tight end, open job at wide receiver on offense. So you've got 4 open spots there. Both defensive end spots are open on the other side of the ball. Middle linebacker, corner, and safety, and kicker. You're not returning a starter. Even if we have a pretty good idea of who's going to get the job at each of those spots, you're not returning a starting player at any of those positions. So you're talking about 9 offensive and defensive open starting jobs plus 1 on the special teams. And if you want to be really smart with your friends, you'd be like, man, you need to keep an eye out on this kicker situation. Ben Sauls might be the biggest loss of the offseason. And that's not exactly a stretch. I don't think that's actually hyperbole or an exaggeration of any kind. Ben Sauls really might be the biggest loss of the offseason for a few reasons. One, because Ben Sauls was really good and really consistent. He was the leading scorer on the team last year. He's one of the great kickers in Pitt history. He was reliable from distance and from close. He could make all the kicks. And they're replacing him with James London, who seems good, has been good, wasn't necessarily good in spring camp. And so that's a bit of a concern. And maybe the biggest concern in terms of departing players. Because when you look at what Pitt lost, they lost their leading receiver in Kanate Mumfield and their leading tackler in Donovan McMillan. But they return their leading passer, their leading rusher, their leader in tackles for loss, their leader in sacks, and their leader in interceptions. So basically all the and their leader in receiving touchdowns too. They lost the leader in receptions, but they returned the leader in receiving touchdowns. So when you look at what they're bringing back, offense and defense, you've got your biggest producers back outside of your leader in tackles, although you do return one guy with 100 tackles. And then, like I said, your leader in receptions, although you do return the guy who led the team in receiving touchdowns. So when you're talking about players they lost, important players that they lost, arguably none was bigger than Ben Sauls, who ran out of eligibility. He didn't go into the transfer portal or anything like that. He ran out of eligibility. And it's going to be tough to replace Ben Sauls. So if you want to be really smart with your friends, you'd be like, listen, the biggest guy they lost was Sauls. Now, he wasn't the only loss that hurts. Like I say, there were 24 players who left via the transfer portal, 17 left in the winter after the season ended, 7 more left in the spring. A slight caveat to that. We'll get to it in a second. But of those transfers who left, there were really 2 that I think hurt the most, 2 most impactful departures. One was Sincere Edwards, a defensive end who had 17 tackles last year, but he had 6 tackles for loss and 3 sacks. He transferred to UCF. He had actually been committed to UCF before he flipped to Pitt. Came in as a true freshman last year, and I think was pretty much in line for a starting job this year. That one stings, given the issues Pitt has and has had at defensive end, and we'll talk about how they tried to address that in a second. It stings to lose Sincere Edwards because he was probably going to be a starting defensive end as a true sophomore this year, and likely would have had a pretty good season. Again, as a true freshman last year, playing in a rotational role, he had 6 tackles for loss and 3 sacks, which for Pitt's defensive ends, that passes for good production. The other notable contributing loss to the transfer portal was Rylan Gandy, the cornerback who transferred to Indiana. He started every game last season at corner and had 40 tackles. He didn't have any interceptions, but corners in Pitt's defense, unless you're MJ Devonshire, don't always get a lot of interceptions. They don't get thrown at a ton. I think Gandy was a really solid corner, and again, he started every game last season. And so it's a loss, and both of these guys, Edwards and Gandy, are both losses in the sense that they were probably penciled in for starting jobs. And when we talked about places where Pitt has to replace a starter or doesn't have a returning starter, defensive end and cornerback were among those. Edwards wouldn't necessarily be a returning starter, but I think he was penciled in for a starting job. Gandy would have been a returning starter. Those are the 2 biggest losses to the portal, though, from the offseason. Nate Yarnell, Jordan Bass, Terrence Moore, Julian Duggar, I think, are all notable departures, but the 2 that are going to hurt the most for this season are Edwards and Gandy. Now, on the flip side, Pitt added 16 transfers this offseason, 13 in the winter, 3 in the spring. And here comes the caveat. The caveat is that one of the additions in the winter, Andy Jean, the wide receiver from Florida, was also one of the departures in the spring since he enrolled at Pitt in January and went into the portal after spring camp ended. Andy Jean, we hardly knew you. Couldn't pick you out of a lineup right now if we had to. We have no idea what your career is going to be like, but I think he ended up at Arkansas, so going back to the SEC. The transfer additions, and this is where you can really impress your friends and sound smart about really knowing what's important here, because the transfer additions, there are two out of the, 16 that they added. There are two position groups that were addressed the most heavily, two position groups that needed the most help, and two position groups that are going to impact the team the most, largely on the strength of what the transfers are able to do. And, of course, I'm talking about the offensive line and defensive end. Pitt added 3 offensive linemen from the transfer portal: Kendall Stanley from Charlotte, Keith Gouveia from Richmond, and Jeff Percy from Michigan. And they added 3 transfers at defensive end: Blaine Spires from Utah State, Joey Zielinski from Eastern Michigan, and Jaden Moore from Oregon. Both of these position groups last year, the offensive line and the defensive ends, both of these position groups last year were not strengths of the team. And in some cases, particularly after injuries affected the offensive line, they were weaknesses to some extent. And defensive end was just never really impactful. I think Jimmy Scott led the defensive ends with 6 sacks. 3 of those came in one game. Sometimes those things are going to come in bunches. That happens. But when half your production happens in one game, never mind that. When your leading defensive end has 6 sacks, that's just not good enough with the kind of defensive style that Pitt plays. So they needed to upgrade that position group. They needed to upgrade both of those position groups. The offensive line had to get better, and the defensive ends had to get better, and they turned to the transfer portal to do it. I think they did well. Kendall Stanley, Keith Gouveia, and Jeff Percy are all experienced offensive linemen who have played in a variety of roles. Stanley was a starter. Gouveia went back and forth in and out of the starting lineup. Percy was not a starter at Michigan, but he played a lot. They've all been in college for a while. They're grown, they're developed, they're more mature, and they understand what it takes to play at the highest level. I mean, relatively speaking, they understand what it takes to play college football, right? Obviously, you're at Charlotte, you're at Richmond, you're not necessarily the same thing as being at Michigan or being in the ACC, but they understand what it takes to play college football. And so I think those guys are good additions, and those 3 will provide the starters, at the very least, at the 2 left positions, the left guard and left tackle. And, the third guy out of those 3 will either be a reserve there or push one of the other starters for a job at right guard or right tackle or something like that. So I think you're going to get good contributions out of these transfer offensive linemen, and a whole lot is riding on those guys playing at a high level so that the offense can play at a high level, so Eli Holstein can play at a high level, so this team can score and the team can win. Now, a defensive end, once again, the staff went into the portal for 3 players, which they did last year too. You remember they added 3 transfer defensive ends last year with Nate Matlack, Chief Borders, and David Ojebwe. They didn't get a whole lot out of those guys. They got 5 sacks or so out of Matlack. Ojebwe might have gotten 1. Chief Borders produced very little. And on the whole, the group was pretty underwhelming. Ojebwe really didn't even play. I think his sack came against Youngstown State or Kent State or something like that. And Borders played a lot but really didn't produce. Matlack played a ton and had a lot of pressures, got close on a lot, but didn't really finish the sacks all that well. I think they did a better job in the portal at defensive end this year than they did last year. I think when you look at Matlack, Borders, and Ojebwe, you have 3 guys who are making fairly big transitions. Whether it's Nate Matlack transitioning from a 3-4 defense to a 4-3 defense, Chief Borders moving from a stand-up outside linebacker to a hand-on-the-ground defensive end, or David Ojebwe simply going from not playing to playing, which, again, he didn't do a whole lot of. So you had 3 guys kind of transitioning more than I think what Blaine Spires, Joey Zielinski, and Jaden Moore are going to do. Spires and Zielinski are veterans. They've played a lot. And Moore got on the field a decent amount at Oregon last year. We've talked about Jaden Moore and how he might have the highest ceiling of any defensive end on the team this season. And so I think they did a lot better, and they're going to fill in that group around Jimmy Scott with these 3 transfers. And it's almost impossible to get less out of the transfer defensive ends this year than they got last year. Barring injury, it's pretty hard to imagine that Spires, Zielinski, and Moore won't produce more than Matlack, Ojebwe, and Borders did. But I don't just think they'll be good by comparison to last year's transfer defensive ends. I think they'll just be good. I think they'll actually produce. I think you'll get a little more out of the defensive ends than you got last year. And I think, Jaden Moore will show flashes of being a potential star. Not a star linebacker, a star at defensive end. And so those are the main additions out of the transfer portal. And like, there are other guys who are going to help. The wide receivers, they added 3, but Andy Jean was one of them. I think Blue Hicks can contribute. The tight end, Justin Holmes, is probably going to have to do something. I think Kavir Baines-Marquez, the safety, is going to be in the rotation. Rashawn Murray, the corner, is going to be in the rotation. But you're really looking, your main contributions from the transfer portal this year are going to be the 3 offensive linemen and the 3 defensive ends. Key guys who graduated, like I mentioned, Donovan McMillan, Kanate Mumfield, Ben Sauls, Gavin Bartholomew. They lost a handful of really important players, key guys to last year's team. They lost a handful of them running out of eligibility. But on the whole, it just doesn't feel like Pitt lost a ton this past offseason. Donovan McMillan, 100-tackle guy. Kanate Mumfield, leading receiver last year. Gavin Bartholomew, we've talked about him a ton. Ben Sauls, very crucial. These are good players. These are important players. I don't want to downplay the impact they made or the importance that they had. But by comparison, to what you could lose in a lot of years and what Pitt has lost in some years, like, I think they're in pretty good shape with what they returned and how they filled out around that group with the transfer portal. Now, one area where they didn't have to fill out around that group or around a group was the coaching staff, because for just the 3rd time in the Pat Narduzzi era, Pitt returned its entire coaching staff intact. That's only happened 2 other times. 2020, they had the coaching staff back from 2019, no changes. And that was the first time in the Narduzzi era, because 2015 to 16, they replaced the offensive coordinator, Jim Chaney, with Matt Canada. 2016 to 17, they replaced Canada with Sean Watson. They also replaced Tom Sims with Charlie Partridge that year. 2017 to 18, they replaced the offensive line coach, John Peterson, with Dave Borbely. And they replaced the defensive coordinator, Josh Conklin, with Randy Bates. They also hired Corey Sanders and Archie Collins to coach the secondary. 2019, Mark Whipple came in and Chris Beatty came in. Whipple replaced Sean Watson as offensive coordinator. Chris Beatty replaced Kevin Sherman as the wide receiver. They kept that staff in place 2019 to 2020. But by 21, there was more changes afoot. Chris Beatty was gone. Brennan Marion came in to coach the wide receivers. Rob Harley was gone, and Ryan Manilak came in to coach the linebackers. 2022, you had another new offensive coordinator and Frank Signetti. You had another new receivers coach and Taekwon Underwood. That staff stayed together 2022 into 2023. And then you come to last year, where you had the biggest turnover of the Narduzzi era. The entire offensive staff completely turned over. Cade Bell, Jeremy Darveau, Lindsey Lamar, J.J. Laster, Jacob Bernowski, all in. Frank Signetti, Dave Borbely, Andre Powell, Tim Salem, Taekwon Underwood, all gone. Complete change on the offensive coaching staff. So you went from the most upheaval and biggest change of the Narduzzi era into stability for just the 3rd time in the Narduzzi era. And I think it's important, particularly on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, I think it's important to keep the defensive guys together because they also brought in Tim Dowse to coach the defensive line. He replaced Charlie Partridge last year, and he returns. It's important to keep the defensive guys together. They've got it humming over there. But I think it was also important to keep the offensive staff together. Last year was the first year in a new offense. Everybody's trying to learn it. Everybody's trying to get comfortable. It's tough to then upend things and start moving guys around. I think it was tough those first few years where they had a new offensive coordinator every year for the first 3 seasons of the Narduzzi era. It's hard to do that. It's hard to have that kind of transition, and I think it's good for 2025 that they're not going to be going through that kind of transition again. They've got Bell, Darveau, Lamar, Laster, and Bernowski back, and I think that's a good thing for this offense. It's a good thing for this team, and it should be a good thing for Pitt's performance in 2025. All right, some basic facts, some basic data, some basic talking points to get you going with your friends this week as training camp starts on Wednesday. We'll have storylines, we'll have the big questions, all those different kind of things to cover here in the next couple of days. And then Wednesday comes and well, we're all going to get sunburns and lots of content. So something to look forward to. All right, make sure you like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Don't forget to check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, to get all your Pitt sports news. And hang out on the message boards because we will have a lot to talk about there. Panther-Lair.com, Pitt site on the 24/7 Sports Network. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Hope you had a great weekend. Let's get this week of training camp started. Have a great Monday. We'll talk to you tomorrow on the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.